Hi, I'm Annalie Bloomfield, CEO at Sustain.Life. I'm filling in for our Chief Sustainability Officer, Alyssa Raid, while she is taking some much deserved vacation out in the woods. This is the week in sustainability, where our team of practitioners and experts get together to talk about some of the most important issues and stories in sustainability this week. I'm joined today by fellow colleagues at Sustain.Life, Constance and Nick. Please introduce yourselves.
Hi, everyone. I'm Constance Duke. I am the Director of Sustainability at Sustain.Life, and I lead our technical practice.
And I'm Nick Lusantag. I'm Senior Manager on our sustainability team, and I work with Constance to help build out our platform.
Thanks, guys. So today we're going to be talking about food. There's been some great articles in the press this week. We're thinking about fake meat, cellular ag, upcycled food, what it means, thinking about sustainability and who it's for. So I'll let you guys take it away.
Sure, I can start. So there was a recent journal article that was published in a sustainable food journal, a peer-reviewed journal, that did a review of plant-based meats and cellular-based meats and their impact, their environmental impacts. Annalie, did we lose you?
No, I'm still here.
Okay, great. Um, And basically, this is new data that we haven't really had before. And so we have a better understanding now of some of these meat alternatives and how they compare to meat itself. And I think some of the most starking numbers came out, obviously from a carbon perspective, but also from a land use and water use perspective. So from a carbon perspective, let's just talk about plant-based meats right now, which are things like Impossible beef, Beyond Burger, those types of things that are made from plant products. Um, they're coming out with a carbon footprint that's about 99% less than beef. That's not that surprising. It's about half or a third of products like poultry and pork. Um, and then looking at it from a land use perspective, also significantly less uh, land use for developing plant-based meats. Makes a lot of sense because you don't need as much land for grazing animals. You just need the land for growing whatever are the plant inputs to your product are. So some really fascinating numbers that I pulled together. So first of all, almost half, 40% of the lower 48 states, almost half of that land is goes towards grazing, pasture, and livestock feed. So basically,
Wow.
40% of our land in the U.S. is for growing animals. And let's say we shift, 20% of meat consumption to plant-based alternatives, we would gain back. This is back of the envelope, but 150 million acres of land, which is about the area of Montana and Idaho combined, and that's only 20%. So I think that's like a realistic, achievable target. And when you think about that much land, you think about all the opportunities for additional recreation and rewilding, and then also carbon sequestration. As if that land grows back into forest, then those trees are sucking up a lot of carbon. And so it's the kind of thing where it kind of has cascading effects, these types of transitions, and also have holistic benefits. It's not just about climate, it's about outdoor space and wild areas for people to enjoy. Um, so pretty interesting stuff. And then on the carbon front, if again 20% of beef consumption switched to plant-based proteins, we'd reduce North American CO2 by about 75 million metric tons of carbon a year. That's about the carbon footprint of the entire country of Chile. So again, huge opportunities, and this is a growing market, but it's really exciting to see some of these new numbers come into the fore.
And remind us, Nick, where does North America or maybe the US specifically, where do we fall in terms of meat consumption?
I think it's something around 12% of the global meat demand is North America or the US. Um,
Yeah, I think I've seen something a little higher, maybe around 22%. So yeah, it's kind of difficult to find statistics around that, but we do know that per capita, North America leads all other regions in terms of meat consumption.
That's wild. So if we think about sort of the global impact of meat consumption, obviously the US isn't, the whole story, but we're, eating meat at an incredible rate.
Yeah, and I think another part of the story is the expectation that developing parts of the world will start to consume a lot more meat as well. And so as that
Mm.
starts to happen, demand will balloon. And so then there is an even bigger opportunity for these types of plant-based products.
This reminds me, do you guys remember maybe back in 2018 that map that Bloomberg put out about land use in the US, and they basically sectioned everything off into the different land uses, like, housing and timberland and grazing. And grazing literally just took up the entire center section of the US map.
Wow.
Was such an interesting illustration to kind of put everything into perspective.
Yeah, it's something we don't really think about, especially if you live in an urban area, because it's something you don't really see. But out west, it's the majority of the land out there, easily. Um, and this is, land use in general, something we think a little bit less about when we're making um, choices in the grocery store. Um, but it's one thing that comes up with grass-fed beef, because grass-fed beef is often marketed as um, a really great product. Maybe some people say it's healthier for you. I'm not really sure. I don't eat beef. Um, but grass-fed beef is not really a viable alternative, environmentally speaking, because, well, you're still eating meat, which is still an inefficient way to get your protein. But more importantly, grass-fed beef just takes up a lot of space, takes up a lot of land. And, if we converted all beef consumption to grass-fed beef, we wouldn't have land for anything else.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think I also hadn't appreciated, and the article mentioned this, that grass-fed beef just takes a lot longer to grow. And so if you think about like the sort of like cow burps as like a big sort of part of the carbon footprint, that just like the cows being alive longer to grow longer eating grass sort of meaningfully adds to their footprint, which I just hadn't ever thought about that dynamic before.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And the methane production is actually something that this new technology called cellular agriculture, cultivated meat, can also address. And I was really excited this week because I saw an article about the Israeli startup called Mermaid. They're working on cultivated scallops, which I think is pretty exciting. This was an article in TechCrunch. Um, and it's not quite meat. Growing meat in a lab is really difficult, trying to replicate the texture and all that. So the really exciting thing about cultivated seafood is that it's easier to replicate the texture. And Mermaid came up with a technology to use essentially upcycled components of algae or microalgae as a growth medium. And just going back a step, I don't know if everyone remembers, but it was almost 10 years ago that the first cultivated burger was served at a London press conference. And with all the research and everything that went into it, it came out to this whopping price tag of $330,000. And so now, 10 years later, there are more than 70 companies who are working on cultured meat, and that same burger would come in at under $10 today. Um, and part of why it's so expensive to grow cultured meat is because it's difficult to and expensive to come up with growth media for it. They typically consume 55 to 90% of the budget. But Mermaid is using microalgae that's fed with bio waste, so it's almost a circular process. And it's very cheap. And so they're anticipating that once their product hits the market, it's going to be even less expensive than current meat alternatives. So they call this cytoponics, cyto for cell, so similar to aquaponics or hydroponics, but cell-based growth. And there's also a lot of investor interest in this we've seen. So we had 15 startups in 2021 who raised $175 million, which was double from what they were able to raise in 2020. And there was one company called Future Meat that raised over 300 million euros in December of last year. So a lot of interest there. And similar to plant-based meats, as Nick had mentioned, cellular agriculture also reduces water and land use by as much as 95% compared to animal farming. We've already talked about the methane reduction. There's also the potential for reducing antibiotics and growth hormones, and all these things that are related to public health and superbugs and antibiotic resistance. And then depending on how the infrastructure is built for cell ag, if they site it in cities, for instance, you can also help reduce food transportation. Although
Yeah.
I do feel I should emphasize here, because we always say this, that the transport of food is much less impactful from an emissions perspective than the food production itself. So what you eat is much more important for the climate than where your food comes from.
Yeah, but if you're saying we could grow fresh scallops in New York Harbor, I mean, who can resist?
And yes, you could do that. Not in the harbor, but in a lab
Fair
Near the
enough. Yeah,
harbor.
near the
near the
harbor.
harbor.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, I think, we talk about circularity a lot, but a lot of times, like, r circularity in practice involves many different parties, sort of materials moving through many different organizations or businesses. But this is kind of a beautiful thing because it's circularity within their own process that kind of feeds itself. Um, so that's really amazing.
Yeah, and the algae upcycling is something I just thought was really cool. And yeah, speaking of upcycling, we saw some things in the news about that too. So maybe let's touch on that as well.
Yeah, upcycling food waste or food byproducts, agricultural byproducts. This is something that already happens for some products, upcycling wheat millings, from milling wheat and taking those products and actually fortifying cereal with it, or taking the sort of solid squished remains of fruits after they've been juiced and putting that into snack foods. But I think it's about a third of food production globally is lost um, between the farm and the consumer's trash bin. And a lot of that is consumer food waste or pre-consumer food waste, like the carrot tops and stuff like that. But a lot of that is also um, these byproducts that a lot of times don't go to don't go to use and just get tossed out or maybe composted at best. But if we can turn them into another product, then we can save a lot of that food.
Yeah, the food waste is always really shocking. And I'll just quickly plug a documentary here. It's a little bit older. It came out in 2014, but it's called Just Eat It, a food waste story. And it's an award-winning documentary. It was such a joy to watch. And it's basically a couple that figures out how much of a problem food waste is. And so they decide for 6 months to live only or primarily off foods that would otherwise have gone to waste. And it's really interesting how it turns out. I don't want to give away too much, but it's worth a watch.
Oh,
Twist
that sounds
ending.
awesome.
Cool. And then this kind of sparked our thinking for other upcycling, other business ideas where that are coming out of the market. And some of the things that I wrote down were there's a company called Ecovative Design, which specializes in using fungi like fungal mycelium, which are basically the roots of fungi, to create products. And so right now their main product is like a styrofoam replacement for product packaging, and it looks just like a cardboard material. You wouldn't be able to tell the difference. The fungi is dead. But the beautiful part about their process is they use agricultural waste products, and so they can obtain those products very cheaply because those are things that would normally not be used or be worth anything, quote unquote, worth anything, and those are products also widely available. Um, so it allows them to bring down costs, and it's kind of a beautiful thing. They were also working on a building insulation product. And that was a while ago. I haven't seen anything about that, but in college, I actually did a little research project growing fungi for them, and that was pretty fun. So shout out Ecovative. Um, and then another idea, very different, is, when we're cooling a space, we have all this excess heat, which normally just gets rejected to the air outside. Um, but thinking about in buildings how we can repurpose that heat for other uses. And so something that I've evaluated in the past and was nearly incorporated into the design for a building was actually pulling the heat from the server closets, because servers need a lot of cooling, and putting that into domestic hot water for the building itself. So it would um, heat the hot water for the showers, um, and also cool the server room. So kind of a circularity within a building in terms of energy flows, which is pretty
Love
cool.
those ideas.
Yeah.
Yeah, we just put in a heat pump hot water heater at my house, and our basement is now really, really cold because the heat pump is sort of, using the ambient heat to
Yeah.
heat the water. And so our basement is really cold, but the rest of the house is so hot because it's the summer. And so we've been sort of thinking that through ourselves and saying like, oh, can we put ducts somewhere in our house to get this cold
Yeah.
air from our
Right.
basement
Funnel the
into the
air.
rest of the
Yeah.
house? So that's probably a project for another day, but I love being able to use things like that internally. It's so cool.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah,
Just
that
use
is
your
pretty
basement
cool
as a
idea.
fridge.
Yeah. Yeah. Or we could start sleeping down there, you know?
Yeah.
There you go. We also have a company up here in Oregon. It's called Loopworks. They make upcycled apparel and accessories, and they're essentially relying on all the waste that comes out of the fashion industry. And I think they also did a collaboration with Delta Airlines to use their discarded uniforms to make
Oh, cool.
into
Oh,
new apparel and backpacks and things like that. So I think that's pretty cool. And I think we have to give a shout out to one of the OG upcyclers, which is TerraCycle, that's been around for over 20 years. And I remember how fascinating this was in the early 2000s, that they would collect snack wrappers that were not recyclable anywhere and basically made them into these colorful purses and wallets and things like that.
Totally. I love these companies who kind of set like a goal for people around how you could actually use waste. Even if like let's say those which I also loved the purses when they first came out with them. I still do, but I'm sure not all of our snack wrappers will fit into purses one day, but it's just so aspirational to see and to think like, wow, you can really turn all of this, quote unquote waste into something really cool and useful and give it another life. And I love that so much. And I think like your documentary, Just Eat It, I feel like I see my fridge as like a personal challenge. How can we use absolutely everything in here? And I think my husband isn't always as excited as I am about that challenge, but I think having these companies and documentaries out there, they really inspire us um, to do more in our own lives and not just inspire us, but give us sort of tactical ideas about how to do that, which is so helpful.
Yeah, and it's something any company can do, assess your processes and look at your activities and find materials that may have another use, whether you upcycle them or reuse them. There are ways to, kind of reduce the amount of operational waste you produce that way.
Absolutely. So I think I had just a few questions for the end as we talk about food. Um, and going back to kind of the fake meat story, the upcycled food products, like who do we think that these products are really best for? Like if we were gonna give listeners kind of some advice around like how do you reduce your personal footprint? What can you do, sort of incrementally yourself? Like who are these products best for, and maybe who are they sort of not as intended for?
Want to give it a go, Nick?
sure. I mean, I think especially the cell-based meats, which are more, I don't know if they're indistinguishable. Again, I've never had it because I don't have $300,000 for a burger. But
It's
but I
less than
think,
$10 now, but it's new technology, so it might be hard to come by.
yeah, but I think the idea is they're pretty indistinguishable from regular meat are much more similar. And so, those definitely fit better into someone who still wants to eat some meat, um, but and wants sort of craves the flavor of it. Sort of the more of the plant-based foods I think are better for like cultural events. You're having a barbecue and you have vegetarians coming over, or not even vegetarians. You just want to offer less meat for environmental or health reasons, something we haven't touched on. Um, then those are a great option because they slot right into the existing cuisine, and they kind of can serve everybody. So those are my thoughts, but I don't know, Constance, do you have anything?
Yeah, I agree with this. Meat or plant-based meats, for people who are already fully plant-based are not really a staple. They're not as important. These people have already committed to eating fully plant-based, and they're fine with eating, just cooked plants.
Just plants.
Just plants, without the processing. But yeah, for people who still want this, even if you have someone who wants to go plant-based in a family that otherwise still eats meat, it just feels more integrated to have something on your plate that looks like everybody else's. So I think that's probably a prime market. Like Nick said, there's so much culture and tradition attached to it. So if people do go to events, it's nice to just have the alternative and not to have to look for non-meat sides or crumbs that you can pick up, to agree with your plant-based lifestyle. So but even for those of us who just eat plants every now and then, it's just kind of a nice to have. And the alternatives that are coming out now, some of them are absolutely amazing. Like, I can't even believe how good plant-based feta cheese is. I don't know how this happened, but it's amazing.
Still haven't tried it.
Absolutely. And then upcycled foods, like where do they fit into this? Is that just great for anyone? Work them in where you can?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, and you see this with Imperfect or Misfits Market or the original Ugly Produce, in France. Those are really popular. It's an opportunity for people to buy more fresh food and often at a reduced cost. And that's food that otherwise would have gone to waste.
Yeah, and you get so many things that you would not normally cook with, like kohlrabi, which
Good
I've never
point.
cooked with before, but that was a challenge, but it was good.
I love it. I know we talked to one great company that was they um work in the seafood industry and they sell their fish offcuts through Misfits Market, which is awesome. It's and we actually had some the other day here, and it was delicious. We served it over salad. I didn't care that it wasn't a gigantic fillet. I felt really good that I was taking a piece of fish that might otherwise have gone to waste. It was just a really satisfying experience. You know, intellectually and physically.
Right. Love it.
Cool. Well, thanks for letting me crash your sustainability week in review. It was a pleasure getting to talk with both of you about food. Do we have any last thoughts for listeners?
I think that covers it for me.
Yeah, I think it's good to emphasize that there are also health benefits and, you know, animal welfare benefits and a lot of things we just don't have time to touch on. But yeah, it's worth looking into, everything that goes along with eating more plants and cutting back on meat.
Totally. Wow. Well, with that, I'm gonna go look for some plant-based feta. Thanks, guys.
I recommend
Thank
it.
you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.